the beginning was Raleigh Kidder. I want you to know that. And you were born, in Kyneton area, and your dad was involved in politics, Elliott Kidder. And was Jackson part of his world at all? Did he have any crossover?
Not a lot with my dad, but my grandfather, Samuel Kidder, used Jackson as his attorney in certain, I don't know if it was land transactions or what, and my grandfather was a Democrat, which there were not a lot of Democrats around here, so maybe that's why he went to Robert Jackson. I don't know. But there is a slight family connection. And my dad, I think, always had high respect for Robert Jackson. My own memory of Jackson really is the funeral. We began to realize in 1954, was it? I was 14 years old then, and this guy was special, and especially when all the justices came to the funeral. And I think they let out school or something like that for us. And but it was on the level of Lucy Arnett coming home, kind of thing. So we knew he was an important guy. And growing up as a kid, my dad was a Republican supervisor, and my family was pretty much Republican. And when I decided to become a Democrat, one of the things I remember before I ran for public office once, I went down and looked at Jackson's tombstone. I said, "How did you do this?" He didn't talk back, but I said, coming out of Chautauqua County and as a Democrat and going to the levels he did is really phenomenal. And so he was, I grew up knowing he was special.
So having grown up that, and your career path takes him to seminary school. He marches in saw Martin Luther King, was in the Mississippi Freedom Ride, and law school. He went to Vietnam. He's an author extraordinaire. A book which, just I'm telling Brielle this, which was the template for what we did as our Defenders of Freedom. Just as an aside, the Buffalo Law Journal is going to do a piece on that today. And then he went into the oil and gas business. And then, I'm sure I'm skipping many steps just because his resume is long. And then became part of the board of directors of our nascent Robert H. Jackson Center. Dan Bratton passes away. And do you remember how you and I even began for our first conversation regarding even the concept of you becoming a
You better tell me that.
Okay, we were at the Paul Bush wedding. In
Florida, huh?
Yeah, and there, and you and I knew I wanted to talk to you because Peter Sullivan had suggested this might be a good opportunity. So that's where we first talked about it, and you did one of those, interesting. and the rest you then got involved. Did you have a sense of kind of this is now 2001, Raleigh, of the Jackson Center, maybe vision? You knew Dan Bratton. I don't know if you ever had any conversations with him concerning this.
Well, I had, before I took over, when Dan was in sort of ill health, he and I had some conversations about it. Of course, you gave me the background research he had done and so on. Well, I think what Dan Bratton's early involvement said to me is that this is more than just naming a building after somebody. I mean, this is, Reuben Fenton was governor. We named a house after him, Somebody else, let's say my grandparents started a church, they name a church after him. But this was more than just naming a building. This was, Bratton was an ideas guy, and he understood, I think, that what Jackson had stood for in terms of the law was different, was special, especially coming from, up here in East Jesus, New York, in a rural part of the country. I mean, it was really a phenomenal, he was a phenomenal thinker, and I think that the Jackson thinking, the idea of Jackson, is what was the magnet for Dan Bratton, and I think that carried over with me. I mean, it's like Chautauqua. How do you define it? It's the idea of Chautauqua. You know what I mean? It's that you don't go back and say, well, it was Bester or it was Miller or whoever. Chautauqua is an idea, and gives it legs, gives it importance. So, but you know, it also is an organization that has to be run. I mean, so a lot of the work you do as executive director is nuts and bolts kind of things, including raising money. But I think that's what drew me to it.
You were talking about raising money. You were we had to interact with some of our original donors. I think you're on the board when Carl was still alive. But then, of course, Betty LeNay and Stan Weeks and some other people that you really cultivated. And do you want to talk a little bit about each of those individuals?
Well, you know, Betty, I was much more, of course, Carl didn't live that much longer after we started it, and Betty was still very much on board. For example, that whole flagpole development out in front of the Jackson Center with a beautiful bronze base and all was paid for by Betty LeNay primarily. I mean, I'd go to her and I'd say, Betty, you know, I thought we were going to be able to do it for 50 grand, but it's going to take 100, you know. All right. And and I remember when we dedicated that flagpole, Joe Fairbank was living, and her husband, and they came over for it, and it was a wonderful thing, I thought. So I guess got to know Betty, you know, quite a bit more. Stanley and Sarita were key in terms of renovating the Gold Room, which is called the Gold Room. And that ended up being an expensive proposition because the lattice work in the corners of the building or of the room is plaster. And so we finally found a plaster artist in Silver Creek who could take images of the existing plaster and make new inserts so that we fixed the ceiling. I mean, this was big money. I mean, I think Stanley and Sarita maybe gave $50,000 to $80,000 towards that. And then they also gave us a lot of the furniture to go in there because they had period furniture and they were getting on in years and they wanted to do something with it. And you'll recall Barclay Wellman was sort of their consultant on all this, and he would go up and say, yeah, I think Stanley and Sarita, it might be good to send this to the Jackson Center. And I think they were, you know, Stanley, what motivated Stanley Weeks as a philanthropist for the Jackson Center, I think, though, had not so much to do with Jackson as with the Masons. And he told me one time, he said, Raleigh, you and Greg Peterson have saved the Masonic Hall. I said, oh, okay. I said, we've saved the Masons. But anyway, whatever the reasons were that Stanley did what he did, it certainly was great benefit to the Jackson Center. And I would say probably the highlight for Stanley and Sarita was when the Chief Justice came, Rehnquist, and they were able to sit on one of their couches with him and have a photograph taken in that room, which says a lot about their mentality, I think, and what was driving them.
And Sarita, it was the building, the actual building, and she'd actually, you remember you had her write a piece on the history of the building.
Yes.
The Italianate and all of that stuff, which I can't pronounce. And then she really liked that aspect of it, you know, the core of it all. Don Bloomquist, talk about Don.
Don Bloomquist was basically hired when I was still on the board. I wasn't an executive director. And he was running an organization called Code, which I guess is still around, which was involved primarily in low-income housing and things like that. But because he was a construction guy and knew construction and was acquainted with you and others, maybe, I don't know what all was behind it, but So you might say inherited Don Bloomquist. Now he was a pretty strong-willed guy, and I'm not the most wallflower type person myself. So we'd get into our but on the whole, we Don and I got along and got a lot of things done. And when I took over as executive director, I think the roof job was already underway. And Don was handling all that. And there had been a repointing of the bricks and so on. And Don was running all that. As the expansion went along, and new state and federal money came in that I was more responsible for, others than Don were brought in to do the work or to do and I was basically, I paid Don to manage a job when I could manage certain things. So we used a lot of the same contractors, but I would be doing more of the jack of the dust, you might say, day-to-day stuff. So,
as I recall, Habitera was our principal architect on that?
It was. Habitera was the principal architect, and stayed with it. Once you have somebody invested in it and have the drawings and you have the dimensions and you have all that kind of stuff, it's pretty hard to shift contractors. Alstrom Schaefer, the same kind of thing. Alstrom Schaefer has done a lot of the electric over there. I don't know if they're still doing it, but they've done so much of it that to try and change horses in the middle of a stream, just doesn't make a lot of sense.
Was E.E. Austin, was that the principal contractor?
E.E. Austin was the principal contractor on the pointing job, and I think maybe on the roof job, although it was done by Jamestown Roofing, I think. So yes, E.E. Austin, but I'm trying to think, maybe, when we got into the basement renovation, I can't recall if that was E.E. Austin. Maybe it was. We'd have to go back.
What I remember so much, Raleigh, was your relationship with our assemblyman, Bill Parment, and how that relationship developed and his interest in the Jackson Center. Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, we couldn't have done this without getting state money, basically. I think we got $200,000 or $300,000 from the federal government through Chuck Schumer. He's a friend of mine. But it's a lot more difficult down in Washington, especially as things called earmarks went away, and it was very hard for individual projects to be run through the legislature in Washington. In Albany, the situation was different. We had Bill Parment was in the majority in the Assembly. Pat McGee was in the majority in the state Senate. And so having a Republican in the Senate and a Democrat in the Assembly worked greatly to our advantage. Bill had to be convinced, I think, that the Jackson Center had legs, that it was going to last, that it was going to be there. And he didn't have to be convinced at all of the importance of Jackson, but he was more concerned about, well, what can you guys stay alive? Can you keep this thing going? And of course, the money, he didn't like to go asking for money, because then he felt obligated to the speaker. And if you know Bill, he's an independent cuss, and he's a conservative Democrat. He's not a liberal Democrat from Manhattan. I mean, he's a Chautauqua County Democrat. So he didn't want to be beholden to the speaker from Manhattan, right? So he was very reluctant to go to the speaker and ask for things, because then he knew that the speaker was going to come back to him on a tough vote and say, hey, Bill, remember what I did for you last year, And by the way, I had a much easier time when I was in the Assembly negotiating with those guys from New York than Bill Parment did. I'd go out drinking with them and have dinner with them, and I'd say, all right. You want this landlord-tenant law, it's ridiculous. It's going to shut down the city, in my opinion, but if you guys want it, but remember, I'm coming back to you in another day. And so I didn't have problems. If I could get money for Chautauqua County, I guess I was willing to pay the political price, much more than Bill was. But once Bill became committed, he brought a lot of money in, and we got the place renovated. Now, it was all capital construction money, so we didn't get operating money. Bill was successful during that period of time getting operating money for the Roger Troy Peterson Institute. They were just getting started. They probably wish they had it today, right? Well, they don't have Bill Parment today. They don't have the majority in the Assembly. They don't have the majority in the state Senate anymore. So here we are in a different world. So the nonprofit world around here, I think, suffers from it a little bit. Not just the nonprofit world, but generally trying to get things done in Albany when you're not in the majority, believe me. I wouldn't stay long if I was in the minority, but that's my own opinion. So Bill, you gotta give Bill credit, yeah.
So it seemed to me there's well over $1 million worth of capital money that Bill was able to obtain through Albany.
And the other thing that helped, I think, was having me as executive director. Since I've been in the Assembly, you can get something in the state budget if you're in the majority and you work at it. But then how do you get it spent? How do you get it out here? That's a whole other deal. But I happen to know that some of this money was coming from the New York State Dormitory Authority. I had one of the women that worked at the Dormitory Authority had worked for a friend of mine in the state legislature. She'd been on the Assembly staff, Ways and Means, as I remember. So I'd call her up and I'd say, "Hey, Lucy," or whatever, and I can't remember her name right now. I said, "It's me, Riley." "Oh, Riley, how you doing?" I said, "Well, we got this appropriation that's coming. Oh, we'd love to do stuff like that. We think we get so many terrible projects. This thing that the Jackson Center is very interesting to us." So, you'd create the chemistry, go down to Albany, work out the contracts, and then the money would have to be approved by the controller and everybody else down there. But I think it helped that I had been in the state legislature and understood government a little bit. So,
Well, just so you know, there are many things Riley was able to accomplish which made him incredibly unique, but that really was at the top, is able to work his way through Albany. And after Pat McGee died, you may have some insight into this. After Pat McGee died, they have a special election, and Kathy Young was running against Nancy Barger. And at least I got a call one day, and you probably got the same call from one of their administrators saying, "Hey, Kathy would like to be in town. Can you use $150,000? Do you remember that?
Oh yeah. Well, Nancy Barger, bless her heart, she worked for me once when I was in the Assembly, and she would have been a great state senator. But it's very difficult for a Democrat to win in that Senate district. I mean, Allegheny County. I used to run an airplane, and fly back and forth to Albany when I was in the state legislature. And as we would come over Allegheny County, if somebody like Bill Parment were in the plane with me, sometimes local people would go back and forth to do state business, and I'd take them along. He'd say, "Well, the only thing I see down there are trees and Republicans." He would say. And of course, he'd run for the Congress before it got beat, so he knew how tough it was in Allegheny County. So, that's local politics, man.
Talking about a plane, you and I and a few others went to Pekin, Illinois one time to the Everett Dirksen Center. You remember when we went out there and we met with the executive director and did all that?
That was a lead-in that came through Sandra Day O'Connor to you, I think. Mm-hmm. And she said that you should go talk to somebody in the manuscript division at the Library of Congress. You'll remember his name probably, but I don't remember his name right now. But anyway, we went down and had a chit-chat with him. And when he said, "Well, I think what you're doing is very important. There's not been a lot of, if any, centers for retired or former justices of the Supreme Court. And this is very interesting." Yeah, I said, "Well, is there any model for us?" He said, "Well, the only one I know about," he said, "that might be a model for you is Everett Dirksen. They put a center together for him in Pekin, Illinois, where he grew up." And so I got a hold of the executive director, and Dan Weinstein agreed to take us King Air and fly us out there. Mm-hmm. And who went along? You and I and
Randy Sweeney. I think Jeanette went.
Jeanette went, yeah.
And John Watkins was the pilot.
Yeah.
And it was, Pekin, Illinois. That was our real first exposure. And there was one walk away from the executive director, because he knew a little bit about Jackson and Jackson's sustainability versus Dirksen. Do you remember his comment?
Basically, he was saying what I had started earlier in this discussion, about the ideas of Jackson, how incredibly important they were for the country, and they're easily defined for whether it's Nuremberg or Brown v. Board or the Barnett case. He was a guy who could apply the law in the real world in a way and then describe it. And it was an incredible gift. He said the problem with Everett Dirksen was, after he died, he was known as a great orator. And do you ever remember the Ev and Charlie show?
Yeah, Charlie Halleck.
Charlie Halleck and Ev Dirksen. This was when John Kennedy was president. You weren't even born yet. And Dirksen would sit on a Senate desk and cross his legs in the Senate chamber, and he'd talk to the press. And I remember the press about John Kennedy's inaugural address. And Dirksen's comments, they were beautiful. He said, "That speech had as much impact as a snowflake falling in the bosom of the Potomac." I said, wow. So I remember things that Dirksen said, but I mean, most of it was political stuff. And the substantive thing that he did was, he had to be pushed into it, I think, was providing 5 or 6 votes in the Senate to get the Civil Rights Act passed in 1965. He came up with some votes on that, some Republican votes to get it done. But the guy in Peking, Illinois, who had come out of Washington. I think he'd been in the manuscript division before he went out and took that job, or he'd been and worked for a congressman or something. He said, our problem has been, what is our mission out here in the middle of this country town? And he said, we decided to make and they had a $5 million federal endowment for Dirksen. Dirksen was a factor in Washington, so when he died, the Congress appropriated money, unheard of, really. And that's still corpus of their foundation. So he said, we had money to continue something. So their mission, really unrelated, I think, to Dirksen in a lot of ways, was to study the committee system of the Congress and make recommendations to the Congress as to how to improve it, how to make it better. Well, it's a wonderful mission. What it ever had to do with Everett Dirksen, I think, is a stretch. But we didn't have that problem, he said, with Jackson. Jackson's words, his thinking, his advancing of the rule of law in ways that the public could understand but were stretching out the understanding of it, including international criminal law. He said, we'll have legs of its own. So,
talking about relationships, you established, well, you had one and then established it, but you enhanced one with the Post-Journal. Post-Journal from the get-go, Christy Herbst, Don Myers, did sheets on quotes of Jackson and programming of Jackson and dropouts. Do you want to speak a little bit to how you kind of connected with them?
Well, I connected with them, Greg, but I think you were also connecting with them. I mean, I think they looked upon the Jackson Center's creation as a very positive thing for the town. They wanted to encourage it. And even though traditionally the editorial policies of the Post-Journal are very conservative and very Republican, Jackson now was a Democrat in past history, and he was gone. So they could overlook the fact that he was a Democrat. And they were interested in what his ideas were, like we've been talking right here, So I think they bought into it, and they put print behind it. I mean, that book, what was it? They printed for us several thousand copies of it, The Words of Jackson or something.
The Words of Jackson, and then subsequently Jackson at Nuremberg. Thousands of
But I credit a lot of that with you, Greg. I mean, you probably had more influence with the paper than I did. But
talking about paper, one of the biggest things that happened during Raleigh's reign as executive director was the announcement and ultimate attendance of Chief Justice Rehnquist. And this is brand new stuff, to have the Chief Justice of the United States show up. Can you speak a little bit how behind the scenes, what was going on?
Well, again, I mean, I credit you with somehow, or maybe with John Barrett's connections and other things in Washington, but he was a former law clerk, and that's what you glomped onto, and you wouldn't let it. It was like you were like a dog with your teeth in his pant leg. You just wouldn't let Rehnquist go. Hey, tell the Chief Justice this is the guy that you law clerked for. He's got to come up here. And I think, remember his partner, the guy that Niebank. You got him involved, yeah. And Niebank, a local Jamestown guy, he helped convince him. Rehnquist himself, I'm not a great Rehnquist fan. He's sort of a prima donna. Not sort of, he was a prima donna, and he liked to be catered to. And I remember we gave him my office when he got here, so he'd have 20 minutes by himself between speeches and photo ops and things. And while I was giving him the office and showing him where everything was, I said, hey, by the way, would you sign this book? And I got Gerhardt's book, I think, off the shelf. He says, I only sign my own books. I said, oh, okay. Well, I grabbed one of his books and he signed that. Then I couldn't believe on the way back to Washington in the plane, he said, here's a guy, the Supreme Court judge says, I only sign my own books. He signed your baseball. And I said, how in the heck, Greg, did you get the Supreme Court justice to sign a baseball? He said, well, you had a 1939 program of the Milwaukee baseball team or something. And he was a big Milwaukee guy. And you traded him for it or something. I mean, I couldn't believe you getting that baseball signed. I mean, but we got through it. It was a wonderful day. These are the kind of days you don't talk about your issues with anybody. You're basking in the glory of a guy that we're trying to honor, and everybody's on board with it. And the building has been renovated a lot. People are celebrating that. And, the local bar association, I mean, getting the Chief Justice here, and you got the next Chief Justice here as well. I mean, it's big. And so my hat's off to you, by the way. I mean, I give you a lot of I was just sort of carrying out your orders with Rehnquist.
Well, just a sidebar, Raleigh was a good sport because he would take my phone calls early in the morning, say, oh God, I'm sure he's saying, oh, here's Greg again with another idea. But he vetted them out. He vetted them, things that were crazy off the wall to stuff, and implemented much. Hey, and speaking of implementing so much, talk a little bit about your Carol Drake. How did you connect with her?
She was really a Becky Robbins call.
Becky Robbins, yeah.
And we needed a person, a secretary / do everything type person. And there were 3 or 4 candidates. I think maybe Lillian Ney had sent Carol Drake our way because she'd worked in her office or something, maybe, I'm not sure. She'd worked in a medical office. But somehow Becky had known about her, and Becky was really, she's Raleigh the one, da-da-da-da-da. And I said, well, hey, you're going to have to work with her, and me, I think I can work with anybody, although my wife might argue with that. But Carol Drake ended up being everything as she was advertised and more. And remember there was that gap after we didn't have an executive director for a while after I left, and she had to fill the shoes, and wonderful.
Kind of the radar Riley. She liked to refer to herself as at Smash.
Yeah.
And then Becky, how did you connect with her?
I just knew Becky, and I forget where she was. We were looking for somebody to do this kind of thing, and Randy Sweeney may have known that she was sort of looking for something. And I'd always liked Becky. I mean, when I was in politics, I think in the early part of my years in the Assembly, I think she worked for a radio station as a reporter here. Mm-hmm. And then she met Dale, and they got married, and then she raised kids for a while, and this and that. But my first, introduction to Becky, I think it was as a news reporter. And again, she comes as advertised. There's nobody that's warmer and more convincing than Becky. And so it was a great team. You could count on each other, and you didn't have to waste a lot of time with niceties and all. You just came into the office, rolled your sleeves up, took Greg Peterson's 10 pages of yellow pad and tried to deal with it, you know what I mean? So
There's a little truth to that too. Part of what we started on was you and I, because you're a history guy. I mean, you're a deep understanding of history and the personalities that go behind that product. And so part of our collective goals was to talk about who we might get here, bring here, personalities that really intersected with Jackson. And we did programming. And I know that one of the Gene Gerhardt, John Dollivois, we had the Nuremberg prosecutors, but you especially had a close relationship with Whitney Harris. Whitney was here not only in 2001, but many times thereafter, and including he wanted to publish a couple of books, which you, having been an author, helped him with. Do you want to talk about you and Whitney?
You know, Whitney was a class guy. I mean, he was one of these fine lawyers that you've probably read about in law school with a, you know, always had a proper suit and tie on and had a silk hanky, and his hair was always unlike mine. He was perfectly put together. When Whitney got up in a podium to speak, people listened. And one of the reasons, of course, they listened is he had the pedigree. And he had the pedigree of being a Nuremberg prosecutor and having been on the podium, had podium time at Nuremberg. And my only regret with Whitney is I was hoping that he would gift the Jackson Center a substantial gift, and we got to him a little too late. He'd already, made a major gift to Washington University, I think, and he was teaching law school there. And but my greatest memory of Whitney is out of nowhere, and I don't know if this came from you, Greg, or somebody just called on the phone one day. We got a request from the Santa Monica Bar Association that they would like to have us come out and make a presentation on the center and on Robert Jackson. And I said to them, I said, well, what would you think if we brought Whitney Harris along? Boom, you know, oh my gosh, this is star power, right? And I spent 2 or 3 days in LA, and I forget the name of this, it's a Jewish center that's on the highway between LA and the Valley as you're going up over the pass on the left there. And we had the Santa Monica Bar Association meeting there. They didn't usually meet there, but because of the notoriety and the importance of it, they had a big auditorium. So we had a couple hundred lawyers in there, and we made some friends, I think, for the Jackson Center. We were hoping to raise a little bit of money, but what amazed me is the number of lawyers that came that day with Whitney Harris's book to meet the guy that had really done it. And it was unbelievable. I don't think you were there on that, but I somewhere maybe in the bottom of the archives, you'll find a video of that Whitney Harris speech at the Santa Monica Bar Association. It was incredible. And his wife was with him. And I think it was one of the last times he made a trip like that, maybe. He was getting on in years, but what a class act Whitney Harris was. And, you know, you compare him with Henry King, who was also at Nuremberg, but I don't think had podium time, but still a wonderful, smart lawyer from Cleveland. You know, Henry King was more like me, a shuffle along in a blue blazer, you know? I mean, I tell you, Whitney Harris, he was right out of, you know, one of the big law firms in New York, Dewey Ballantyne or someplace like that, right? He was unbelievable.
And what prompted him to, you know, he talked to you about doing 2 books on Rudolph Hearst and Murder by the Million, and one other book that we were part of, you actually proofread his stuff and stuff like that.
Yeah. One of them, I think the Jackson Center published also.
Could have been, yeah.
Yeah.
How did that happen? How did those 2 books happen?
You know, I think that Whitney wanted to get them done. He was getting later on in his life, and we just needed to help him get through it and get it done. I don't think he was looking for, you know, a major, you know, Harper and Row, trade book. I think he wanted to make sure that his reflections on Jackson and other things were properly, it was all being gotten out of his system later in his life. But yeah, we helped him do that, and there was a lot of phone calls back and forth. Those are the days of faxes, so a lot of stuff went by fax, and I'd mark things up and fax it out, and then he'd fax it back, and so on.
He was very, very grateful to you for all of that stuff. And it was during that time period we did the law clerks came here, Jackson's law clerks, and then we also did Linda Brown. You remember that?
Yeah.
Any reflections on the Linda Brown 50th anniversary?
I remember her sister was there as well.
Cheryl.
But Linda was more the spokesperson for the two of them. And let's face it, we knew it at the time. They were just little girls when all this was happening. I mean, but they over the years stepped up to represent the African American black community. They would say that, hey, we were growing up, where was it, St. Louis or someplace? Where were they, Greg?
Kansas.
Kansas City, yeah. Anyway, they would say, hey, we weren't living in a deep ghetto or someplace that was terrible. We had a good family thing going. It was just the principle of these things, and my dad decided to fight for it. And why did we get there? Because usually the Supreme Court, when they consolidate cases, and there was a whole bunch of these cases, but they take, as I remember, the lowest thing in the alphabet. And B, Brown, came before C, Carlson, or whatever. And so the case was named Brown v. Board. But there were many litigants but she said our family, of course, got prominent because the case was named after us. So, but that was important and significant, and I think the highlight of kind of thing, the Jackson Center. Why do people come to the Jackson Center? Nobody knew this guy, but it's what he did. Brown v. Board even, he wasn't the main author of the opinion, but he was on his deathbed more or less, and Earl Warren said, I want this to be a unanimous opinion. What do we got to do to get you on board, Justice Jackson? And he said, I don't want to overpromise, because we as a court cannot enforce what we're going to be doing. This is going to go into the court system. And it's the executive branch, it's local governments that run education. How do we really make this work in the real world? And so Jackson is sort of dragging his feet a little bit based upon the court's going to do something that really then the court can't carry out itself. But he said, if you make it simple, it wasn't something, don't rely a lot on the 14th Amendment or something, just go right to the heart of Plessy versus Ferguson and say it was bad law. I think I can go along with it. And so when he came in with his opinion, and I think Warren wrote the opinion, didn't he? And it was only a couple pages. And as I recall, he gave that to Barrett Prettyman to review, and Barrett Prettyman would see Jackson regularly in the hospital and say, it's not bad. I think it meets most of your requirements. And so when the chief came in to see Jackson had read it, said, yeah, I'm up, and that was it. It was a unanimous opinion. But some people think that Jackson's a little bit reluctance. He shouldn't have been as reluctant. He should have been the greatest thing in civil rights ever been done, But he was a pragmatist, and he wanted the law to be able to work. He didn't just want to pontificate and make statements about it. He wanted the final thing to work. And Nuremberg in the same kind of way, I think. He's over there with the Russians and the French and the English, and none of them really want this trial. It's the Americans that are pushing for it. Jackson wants a trial. And, finally it got down to politics. The Russians were making so much trouble. Finally, I think he told them with Truman's okay. Hey, we'll go on, we'll go without you. Oh, we can't do that. You know, he had to use the trump card to get the Russians to go along. And then, but the process, with the way the judges from each of the 5 Allied powers, and the backups and everything else, it worked. And the decisions were not outrageous, and as best they could, it wasn't a kangaroo court. It wasn't, it was victor's justice in a way, but they had their own lawyers. They had the right to present their own evidence, make their own case, defend themselves. And what we have is the record of the Nuremberg trial. I mean, you'll probably never see another one, but boy, oh boy, it's a standard out there that's the gold standard, really.
Well, we had a chance to go to Nuremberg, and what was your reflections of that, going to actually the location, the actual courthouse, walking in, seeing where the jury was, where the Nazis were?
Yeah.
What was your sense of all that?
You know, the biggest sense, of course, I'd never been to Nuremberg. I'd been in Germany before. But what impressed me about that trip, Greg, was the trip we took down through the documentation center. And it said to me that the German people have come to grips with the Holocaust. And, you know, there's been criticisms over the years that the Japanese people never came to grips totally with some of the things they did in China and during the Second World War and stuff. But I think the German people know now how bad it was. They were the perpetrators of it, and they support what's going on at Nuremberg. And we now have, the Jackson Center has continuing relationships with some of the institutions there. And to me, that's where the future of the Jackson Center also probably will have its longest legs.
We also had a chance, because the three-legged stool that we sort of created as a mission, Jackson the person, you know, from Spring Creek to Frewsburg, you know, how did that happen? 2 is sort of that international criminal law, Nuremberg. 3rd is the domestic law, you know, it's the Solicitor General, Attorney General, Supreme Court Justice. And we actually had a chance, the Jackson Center, to go into the court as a guest of Rehnquist, it turns out, and Christopher Dodd spoke. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I remember Dodd, and you know, I don't remember the Jackson and Dodd were that close in Nuremberg, but having Christopher Dodd, another wonderful way to tie things together. You know, you think about it, I mean, those connections are going to have to be stretched out, new connections found. As the further away you get from Nuremberg, but hey, it's all good what goes on at the Jackson Center. Nice to be a part of it. Glad you're here for the summer.
Well, and part of, I think, the mission that you've just really started with a few others was the fact that you got to know where you came from in order to know where you're going to. That's always felt that strongly about that. And that's part of what Brielle is doing, saying, here's our path over the last 20 years, so we know at least where some of the people were. We're standing on the shoulders of those people like yourself and Jeanette and Randy Sweeney and Carl and Dan and others. Doesn't mean you have to follow the straight line, but at least you can jump off from there.
Brielle, there's an article you need to read, and I don't know if it was written in the Times or if it was just a standalone piece by Jackson called The County Seat Lawyer. And Jackson, I think did he write that when he was Attorney General or was he in the court then? I can't remember. But it's about how he learned the practice of law in the real world in places like Mayville, New York, and the Warren County Courthouse. And these are real people. The law applies. If it doesn't apply to real people, then it's phony law, basically. And you know, I think Nuremberg was started with a small idea, maybe, and to the extent that Jackson probably was saying to himself, he said, well, back in Chautauqua County when we had differences, we didn't get a gun out and go shoot each other. We go to the courthouse. Why don't we go to the courthouse after the Second World War? See what the courthouse has to say. It was a very practical application of the law, really. A small idea, but such a big idea. And I think that's, you know, as the law has become more sophisticated and more segmented and so on, that common sense approach, that let's go to the courthouse and figure this out, has been lost. And Jackson, that's part of what made him such a great person. Not only he was a smart and skillful writer, and he got lucky too. He got involved with a president that had 4 terms. That doesn't hurt, right? But his ideas coming from this small community and just thinking, well, why don't we try it in Nuremberg, I think is really what sort of was the bottom line motivation, you know.
Raleigh, as I mentioned to you, Brielle, that did many things which really we're the beneficiaries of today. And one of the things was he established a docent system where we had volunteers come in and learn about the Jackson Center. In fact, I just put up a long lost and forgotten audio tape of you talking about the center. So that's now up.
What about that old tape that we ran forever, we put up on the screen, that you put together, without any copyright approvals or anything, of course, but it has Nuremberg and Nazis marching,
Still
and it has,
used.
and then Nancy Dale Connor stands over in front of the statue, and then it comes back, and that was terrific.
Yeah.
In 10 minutes or so, people got the idea. Peterson. Make sure you document that.
Yeah, yeah. We're still using that. But he had a special relationship with one of those, and we honored her recently. And I want you to speak to Fran Galbato. Fran was and Jim Oria, but really kind of above the fold.
Well, Fran, I got to know Fran because she and her husband owned Bridgeotis. And I go over there when I was working in my office for the oil and gas company. I was over at Anderson Cleaners for a while. So I bought a lot of sandwiches over there at lunchtime. And Fran was always there. I got to know her, just a wonderful person. Carla was working there at the time. So when I got over to the Jackson Center, I forget, we were looking for docents, and I said, you know, Fran, who's retired, maybe she'd be interested. And I think she brought Oria in. And they were part of a group that were part of what called the Lost Neighborhood Group. When they put in what's now Brooklyn Square, they ripped out everything else that was there, including a community of houses where people lived. It wasn't happy time for them. But the old neighborhood group, and they're mainly Italian families, Italian-American families, who all grew up with each other. And so they, in their retirement years, they did things together. And so I think Fran, you know, her husband would come in for special events. Tom, we'd get the food from Bridgeotis. Most of the time we never paid for anything. Jim Oria would get a few other volunteers, and we'd put on spaghetti dinners and things like that. But Oria, he'd be another good guy if you haven't interviewed him, Greg. Have you ever interviewed Jim Oria?
Never have. I will.
I mean, he's still sharp, and last night I haven't talked to him in a year or so, but Korean War veteran, a little bit older than me. And I remember he'd say to me, one time I was thinking about writing a book about, remember that con that escaped around here, run by Bucky.
Bucky Phillips.
Bucky Phillips, yeah. I said, you know, maybe write a story on that, man. That would be something. He said, Raleigh, stay away from that kind of stuff. Or he said, you got to stay on the serious stuff. I know you could write a story about Bucky, but then you just make him look good. Blah, blah, blah. I said, well, okay. I said, I'll stay away from it. But Oria, we took a trip, and we got to wrap this up.
This is great.
One of the things that I enjoyed doing at the Jackson Center was at the time, I was also on the committee that built the World War II Memorial in Washington. And so after the memorial was dedicated in 2004, we decided to have the center would sponsor a bus trip. And Oria was a part of that, and Franny and Tom and Galbato and we packed the bus, mainly with World War II veterans and so forth. You know who our doctor was? John Lamancuso.
Really?
Because his dad, Mike,
Yeah.
is a World War II veteran. Mike just died last year. And Mike was a World War II veteran in the Italian campaign. Of course, he grew up in an Italian family around here, right? So he's on the front lines, and his commanding officers are saying, go up and talk to those guys in Italian and tell them if they don't surrender to us, you're in trouble. I mean, Mike, can you imagine being in Italy and coming from an Italian family in Jamestown? Another guy was Tony Costanzo. Yeah, he's in that book I wrote, Tony Costanzo. Oh, what a guy he was. But they all grew up around here together. I don't know how I'm getting where we're going with this. But the trip to Washington on that bus, I said to Oria, I said, now listen. I said, I know the geologic history of the Appalachian Basin and Range Province. I've read a ton of books about it. I was in the oil and gas business. So I said, I can talk geology as we get into the coal mining area there, and then there's oil and gas all mixed together, and you're coming down through Altoona, and then you go up to Breezewood and over the top of the hill. But I said, when we get to the top of the hill at Breezewood, going out of Breezewood, I said, I want you to talk about the Civil War history we're going through, because Antietam is out that way, and you're not far from Gettysburg, and blah, blah, blah. So we gave the people on that bus a geologic and Civil War history. And then we got to the World War II Memorial, and of course, I knew the guy that had been the main clerk of the works for it. He put together a slideshow at the hotel that night, Barry Owenby. And then the next day, on our way out of town, I got Ray Caskey, who's the sculptor for all the bronze work at the World War II Memorial, who had his studio out in Maryland and on Rhode Island Avenue. And we went out Rhode Island Avenue to Ray's studio, and we spent an hour there with the sculptor of the World War II Memorial, going over the plaster casts that were still there of different things that were in the memorial, ideas for the memorial that he brought but were never approved, and he just stacked in one side of the place. And let me tell you, people that went on that trip, a lot of them would come up to me after I left the Jackson Center, and they'd say, boy, the greatest thing I ever did was that trip probably with you. And of course, they were all old timers, and but it was a very, very memorable time. And Oria, I've been coming back to Oria, you definitely should talk to him.
He's on our list. Brielle made some notes because she's working right now in your time period. What have we missed?
Well, you have mentioned every single name I had written down and every single note. You took care of everything. But something that you said about how it's really important to take a look of where we've been and be thankful for that, because I think now more than ever, Jackson's words are really important and to help us figure out where we're going. So thank you for everything that you've done, and you too. Because I think starting this, you said multiple times that you knew it was important, you knew it was a great idea, but you didn't really know where you were going. You didn't really know the importance of it in the moment until later, now 20 years later in 2020. And I think it's really, 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 I don't even know how many times I can say a really important foundation that you have created.
Well, I'm not sure, is there a question?
No, there's
no. You
We'll
covered
take it.
every single thing I wrote down.
Thank you for your comments, and I would.
It should be the new executive
Right,
director,
I mean-
20 years from now.
But I'm serious about getting this guy and what he's done cataloged
Yes.
so you can get to it all because he's not going to live forever. I know he thinks he is, but we got to make sure that we can get our hands on all this stuff. You can do what you want to do with Rehnquist baseball. I don't care about that, but I'm talking about the other stuff. Well, anyways, thanks for the opportunity for me coming over.
Well, part of what we're doing, I'm so thrilled you came in, Raleigh, is you're always looking for anniversary excuses. I'm an anniversary guy, so the 20th of when we really got started, the first meeting with Betty and Carl and Tom Cardman was here in that office where we had December 14th, 2000. So that's an excuse as any as our Founders Day. You remember how we get together with Betty and stuff like that? So we're gathering with Ed Tomasini, among others, all the programs. Get them up on YouTube. That's good. But then Brielle has agreed and is working her way through taking those and putting them on one page. So you'll actually go to one page at the Jackson Center. It'll start at the beginning, Harold Adams speaking at Town of Carroll, and then Gene Gerhardt, and then John Dollaboys, and boom, boom, boom.
Yeah, wonderful.
Then Raleigh Kidder, all those big programs that he launched. We have a huge event. We honored Raleigh. It was.
Oh yeah, you've honored me enough. I mean, don't worry.
No question. Well.
All right.
Well, thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me over. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well.
Great.